Hi there. Welcome to The PrevenTable, the podcast giving you a seat at the table with conversations about the intersection of alcohol, drugs, and mental health in everyday lives. Take a seat and join us.
Welcome to The PrevenTable. We've got another great episode for you today, but before we really even start, I just want to again give like a huge shout out to Hubbard Radio for giving us the space and the equipment and all the stuff to be able to be in season 4 of this podcast, which sounds totally like insane. I can't believe we're there yet or already, but again, just really huge thank you to Hubbard. And speaking of thank yous, we today have a repeat guest. I want to say this is maybe third or fourth time being on the pod. And usually when he tells me to do something, I do it. So this is one of these instances. This is the second episode that we are devoting in the month of September to the topic of suicide. September is Suicide Awareness Month, Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. And there's a ton of overlap between substance use and suicide. Both are mental health topics that demand conversation and concern. And can both of things be prevented. So with me today is John Gaal. Again, John, you need a certificate or a jacket or something. And John is the Director of Worker Wellness for the Missouri Works Initiative. And he told me, Nicole, we're bringing my friend Tim on too. And Tim Rowden is a lost survivor and a volunteer with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And when John speaks, I listen. So welcome back, John, and welcome, Tim, to The PrevenTable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me again.
So, John, I'm going to start with you. Why the hell did you want Tim to be part of this?
We've known each other for quite some time, and sadly, we are kindred spirits in another way. So we are both lost survivors. I lost my son in March of 2017 to suicide, and a few years later, Tim lost his son as well.
Tim, that's a hell of an introduction.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us today. I believe that you are here to share your story and tell us how we can prevent other losses from happening.
Okay. Thank you for having me. Yes, as John said, I lost my son to suicide on September 10th, 2021, which ironically is Suicide Awareness and Prevention Day. He was 22, living on his own. He had been disrupted, like all of us were, by the COVID pandemic. It interfered with his work, with his school. He had, we believe he had PTSD from an accident that occurred at his workplace where he witnessed a customer get killed when a car crashed through the front window of their shop. It barely missed him. He was waiting on the customer. The day we lost him, there were other personal issues that were happening at that time. But it's a wound you never get over. I describe it to people as when you get that news, it's exactly the feeling of having someone reach in and pull your heart out of your chest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, Tim, you had mentioned PTSD, just post-traumatic stress syndrome. John, I know your son suffered from CTE, which is a trauma, a different kind of trauma. Could you remind folks, maybe who are hearing it for the first time, could you remind folks what CTE is and talk a little bit about your son's journey?
Sure. Yeah. So John Jr. Played several different sports in high school. The two he loved the most were soccer and football. and he got permission to play both in the same season. And he was on the field quite a bit on both of those fields. And in junior year, he suffered no less than 2 concussions, and senior year was the same thing. And in both years, one was from football and one was from soccer. The problem in the senior year, they were both at the end of the season. The football one happened, and he was knocked out. We sat him out as per the protocol back then in 2009 for 2 weeks, and he was released to go back to play. And in his first game back in soccer, he goes up for a head ball and is concussed again. He got knocked out another time. And so that's a bruise on top of a bruise. That's second impact syndrome, and that's really detrimental in the world of concussions, especially come back from. Mm-hmm. And so he fought for 6 years because he took his life in 2017. The bottom line is the CTE was diagnosed by Dr. Ann McKee up at Boston University. She's diagnosed many hundreds of NFL football players who've taken their lives. Most have had CTE diagnosis. So there's 4 stages. John was stage 1. That's the lowest level. They diagnosed him with stage 1 CTE in December of 2017. So CTE is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The thing is, 7.5 years have passed, and we know a lot more today than we did back then, obviously. And the researchers are trying to change the language so that we're not solely looking at concussions.
Sure.
And they say we need to really look at repetitive head impacts.
Which is why we've talked about helmets.
That's right.
And so going from hard hats to helmets.
Right.
Right. And making sure that people who are in construction and in places where they could have impacts, that those hats are not falling off, that
right.
They're really protecting their brain. Right.
Correct. So that brings Tim and I back together again, because he is the editor of the Labor Tribune, which is the official newspaper of the unions in St. Louis region.
There we go.
And so our paths cross all the time, because he, unlike you, I reach out to on many occasions and say, hey, I think I got an idea.
Yeah, I'm sensing a common theme here. Something else that I know related to this topic today, something else I know that you all unfortunately have in common, is that you all have become those people that other people call, right? When something happens. When John, you were telling me a story where, you're settled down for the evening and the phone rings and it's a parent or it's a partner or it's somebody who has lost someone to suicide, and they are reaching out. And just for the record, this is not unlike if you lose a kiddo or a partner or a parent to substance use.
Correct.
There are people like the Fitzwalters, they're not trained grief counselors, and yet they have the life experience, unfortunately. They have the tools to be able to support other people going through that same thing, because unfortunately, it's not something that's widely discussed, and there's not a ton out there yet. So you're really sort of leaning on each other. So unfortunately, a commonality that you both have is that you are lost survivors. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about what happens when that phone rings and you know that it's somebody on the other end who has just gone through the unthinkable?
Well, it's just happened to me 3 times in the last 6 weeks. two tradespeople, and one a family friend. And it's almost as if you have to start the clock over again, because in my mind, and I think Tim will share somewhat the same feelings, is that in this area of suicide, there are numerous programs when it comes to suicide prevention, and there are a lot of programs when it comes to suicide intervention, but there are few, if any, that we are actually utilizing in this region with regards to suicide postvention. Is what you just described. What do you do?
Yeah.
What do you do in those first 24 to 72 hours? And so it's kind of lit a fire, I think, under both Tim and I. I don't want to speak for him, but it certainly has for me. And that's why we reached out to you.
Absolutely. So, Tim, talk to me a little bit about what the postvention looks like, or what you think it should look like.
Before I get into that, I would like to mention that I was one of those people who called John in the middle of the night.
Because who else would you call?
Who else would I call? He was
Right?
the only person I knew at that time who had lost a child to suicide. And I had no idea where to turn. And I think that's what is needed in postvention. We need a resource to reach out to folks, or that they can reach out to in that time of crisis, because in an instant, your whole world just dissolves around you and you don't know where to turn.
And with John in particular, I would imagine you felt comfortable because you're both in the same field.
Mm-hmm.
You're both kind of like, middle-aged white dudes, like probably from similar spaces, right? And it's again, that's that power of peers.
Right.
Like, you wish you didn't have the same experience, but you do. And so you picked up the phone and you called him. And knowing John like I do, I'm sure he dropped everything. And it broke open the wound again. That probably just starts to scab over, and then somebody else calls.
Right. And I have to say, I felt heavy for John making that call,
Right.
because I knew what he had been through.
Right.
I didn't realize the extent of it until I went through it myself.
Yeah.
And now, Tim, are you getting those calls too?
I do not receive them the way John does. My effort in this space, as a volunteer for AFSP, I give Talk Saves Lives presentations on identifying and helping individuals who are in crisis. I do the usual tabling, working at fairs and events, reaching out to folks, and it's stunning to me every time how many people come up to us at those tables who have lost someone or who are struggling themselves. And it's frustrating because we are not healthcare providers.
Sure.
We can provide information, but we can't provide the assistance they need at that time.
So I know that I have asked this question multiple times. And some people might be listening and going, okay, we get it. But I also know that not everybody listens to this religiously. Okay. So again, Tim, the Talk Saves Lives. Help folks understand that asking the question does not mean that you're planting an idea in someone's head, and help me understand what are the questions to ask and why those questions are so important. Please.
Absolutely. It does not plant the seed. Research has shown that asking someone if they're thinking about suicide does not increase their risk. If they're thinking about it, they've already got the idea in their head. It's important to ask people how they are, how they're doing, if they're in crisis, if they're thinking about hurting themselves, and if they're thinking about suicide. Because honestly, if you're with someone that you feel is in crisis, you may be the only person who has asked them directly, are you thinking about taking your life? And that can make all the difference in the world, because at that point, they can reach out to you and you can help them get the help they need. You can direct them to the 988 Suicide and Life Crisis Hotline. Stay with them. Make sure that they are safe until help arrives, until somebody professional can come and help them and guide them through the process. But absolutely, you have to ask the question.
John, I know that there's a lot of guilt and there's a lot of, why didn't I see this sign, or why didn't I do this, or why didn't I do this? When someone loses someone to suicide and somebody calls you and says, why didn't I know? How did I miss it? I'm never going to forgive myself. Like, how do you answer those questions? Because that's a normal feeling, right? It's a normal feeling to feel somehow responsible. So how do you answer those questions?
Well, you really have to get them to take a step back and consider the fact that this didn't just happen. This was something that was building. And another thing that people often feel that it's just one issue, and it's never one issue. It's compounded by substance misuse, by a divorce, by a lost job, by maybe suicide, a recent suicide in their own family. So
Chronic
that's why.
pain.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. Look at, for instance, with my son was the chronic pain from the head injury, and that caused other issues: anxiety, depression, eating disorder. So it's very complicated. Suicide is a very complicated issue. So you got to try to reason with them to get them to understand that it wasn't about you. There probably wasn't anything you could do other than what you've already done by being a good parent or being a good friend, being a good spouse. Tim nailed it. I mean, if you from the standpoint of suicide intervention, you have to be aware of the warning signs. And if you see those warning signs, you have to act. You can't wait. And it's better to, in my opinion, make a mistake by asking a question than not asking it and regretting it later, which is what you're suggesting. So I would have to say, in the work that Tim does with Talk Saves Lives, probably leaning more towards the prevention side and delving into the intervention side, because he talks about warning signs and things of that nature, right? I actually do training for QPR, which is question, persuade, refer. I would say some people would say that's suicide prevention, but I think it leads more towards suicide intervention because it gives you a lot of information on what to be looking for and what to do in that time frame.
I mean,
like active
when
listening.
you're doing
and
a
Tim mentioned
QPR
some of
training
the,
or even an S. That's right. When you're doing a QPR training or a signs of suicide training, like an SOS training, I mean, you are learning how to ask the tough questions.
right.
You're learning how to persuade or convince or go with them to get help, and then you're providing the resources. And it's it's like making a pact of sorts, saying that, can we promise to keep yourself safe for the next 30 minutes, the next hour? Can we talk tomorrow morning? Let's meet for coffee tomorrow morning. And then really referring them to the resources, which, as you described, John, is really kind of that intervention, because you are saying, like, I'm concerned about you. I want to help you. I care about you. I love you. I want you to live.
Right.
Like, that's such a huge part of it. But what Tim is doing, I think, with this Talking Saves Lives is, like, what if you don't see the signs, right? What if you don't know that they're even considering it? Is that right, Tim?
That's true. But there are signs to look for.
Could you talk about what that is?
If someone is starting to withdraw, if they start drinking or they start drinking more heavily, if they start using drugs and they've never used drugs before, or they start using drugs more heavily, these are all signs. But withdrawal is a pretty high marker there. I'd like to also get into, if I could, because John mentioned this. Suicide, again, is not caused by one factor. Most people, in fact, I would say all people who take their lives are suffering from a mental health condition, which may or may not be treated. My son Ian suffered from depression from his teens. I suffer from depression. We had him to see therapists. He was seeing a psychiatrist. He was seeing a therapist at the time. But at the moment of crisis, it wasn't enough. Mm-hmm. So you need someone there who will ask that question when that crisis moment arrives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you feel like support systems are adequate, Tim. I'm not asking like your personal support systems, but just like in general, do you think we're where we need to be?
I think our mental health system is grossly underfunded. It can be difficult to find a therapist. It can be difficult to find a psychiatrist to get in for an appointment.
And that's with insurance.
Because there simply aren't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And postvention wise, I think John can discuss this. It's non-existent. I was fortunate that I did have insurance and was able to seek help for myself after the death of my son Ian. Without it, I don't know what I would have done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially as someone who already has depression and things like that. Like that's really a time where the village and all of its different nuances like really needs to come together and step up.
Right, absolutely.
So John, what are you doing about this, my friend, besides coming on here?
Well,
I know you got some wheels churning, dude. What are you doing?
Well, when I started banging the drum and people started to listen, they said, well, we do have something. And I'd say, well, let's meet and talk. And so the same organization that Tim does Talk Saves Lives for, ASSP, I've been involved with in one way, shape, or form since little John passed away. We always do the walk in September, volunteered for other events before. But they came to me and said, hey, and we do the Lost Survivor Day as well. Often, I
When
secure.
Is that?
That is it's always the Saturday before Thanksgiving, and it's about a 6-hour event where I've been to every year since John passed away, and I would say sometimes there's 60 people there, sometimes there's 40 people there, and it's a day to memorialize your loved one. And they've got coordinated activities, sometimes in a large group and sometimes in breakout groups. Because Tim and my concern about suicide of a child is different than the suicide of a spouse or of a parent, and so on and so forth. So they have those breakout groups that they can talk peer to peer. So that organization also has a bereavement program, and it's their form of postvention. Okay, so it's called Healing Conversations, and so I got involved with that. But the catch there is, it's typical that someone doesn't call for many months or years on end before they make that call. And it's not an outreach from AFSP. It is the victim's family reaching out to AFSP to set up that appointment, to set up that peer meeting. So I want to be more proactive. There are some programs out there. One was created by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Frank Campbell down in Louisiana. I think it was part of his doctoral dissertation 30 plus years ago, and it's called Loss. local outreach for suicide survivors, but it just really hasn't picked up steam here in the Midwest.
Yet.
Another,
Yet.
yeah, well, another popular program in the military is called TAPS, TAPS. It's an acronym as well, and that stands for Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. And that one, I've done a lot of reading on it and reached out to the organization in the DC area. I'm in the midst of talking with the person who developed it, and she seems to be pretty open to discussing it and working with us possibly to show us how we might be able to massage that to work for the construction industry. Because the fact is, I don't want to boil the ocean. My goal is to take care of the construction workers now, because the CDC data from 2016, you've heard me mention this before on your podcast, basically says that construction as an industrial sector is number one when it comes to opioid misuse, and it's number two when it comes to suicide. Those things go hand in hand. And so I feel I have an obligation to do something. I can't sit back and rest on my laurels. This is something we can do. I know we can do this. And so Tim and I are joining forces, and we're actually working with an organization called MSPN, Missouri Suicide Prevention Network. I got a call from them about 6 months ago and say, "Hey, John, guess what? If you look at our 2024-25 goals, one of the goals is postvention." So I know we're at least raising some awareness. And so after they did that, Tim and I reached out to them and said, "Hey, you need some support, more support. We would gladly join your organization and try to help you in whatever way we can." So it's just one small step after another, honestly, Nicole.
I just got the goosebumps. Tim, this is going to sound like a really crass question, and I hope it's taken with the spirit in which I mean it. Do you ever get tired of talking about this? Like, do you ever wish that you weren't so public so that people would just leave you alone, because some days you just don't want to have to be the talking head about suicide?
No.
Okay.
I wish I didn't have reason to be the talking head about suicide.
Got it.
But as John mentioned, we've had some suicides in our local construction industry just in the past couple of months. And one of our unions reached out to me after they lost a member and asked me to come speak at a workplace safety meeting. And I was glad to have the information to share with them. I was glad to see that they were exercising their own postvention, because this was shortly after they had lost their coworker.
Yes.
And if I can do that, if I can give talks and save one life, then it's worth it. Well, because one life is the whole world to a family,
yeah,
to coworkers, to a community.
Yep.
I mean, it's not just a data point, right? I mean, it's a human being, and it's a integral part of some, like, of a family, But I think what you're describing, and I didn't even think about it, would be like when that happens, when postvention, when a loss happens. You mentioned a workplace, right? I know that there have been experiences where a student has passed away, died by suicide, and we get calls at PrevenTed. I get calls from my teacher friends going, "They're not doing anything. This was a student. This was a member of our community. This was a fellow teacher." And like, yes, it's nice to have some, crisis intervention counselors, But then there's also that longer period of grief and the
Yep.
stages of grief that come, which is not just immediately after, right? Like there's a whole process. And, I know that as somebody who I just love my team members so much, like it would be a huge ripple effect if one of our team members passed away from anything. And
Right.
then in particular, if they had died by suicide. John, can you talk about the ongoing support that's needed, not just in that 24 hours, although that is very critical, obviously.
Yeah. In the first, like I said, 24 to 48, 72 hours, as Tim mentioned earlier, you just feel like somebody just reached in your chest to pull your heart out, and you don't know where to turn, because there really aren't a lot of resources out there that are publicized for people in that predicament. And I think that's the thing Tim and I would like to change. But that's the short term. So, there's the medium term and the long term as well. And as you mentioned, so in that first phase, that acute phase, the TAPS program actually refers to that as the stabilization process, where you really need to be there to support people, because they are probably in shock, and you need to
Sure.
help them through
Absolutely.
this. So they're if it's not shock, we could call it at least intense grief. So you need to work through that by
Why? What happened? How? Like
yep.
all the things, right?
Right. So kind of do almost like a needs assessment. You hate to boil this
Sure.
down to a business case, but it's really a model that could be applied here. The second phase they call is the grief work, which was what you're alluding to. We used to call it complicated grief. I think they changed the term to prolonged grief now, and it's pretty much grief that goes beyond a normal period. So whatever normal is might be 6 weeks, it might be 3 months. People uh, are not, you mentioned the stages of grief, and often people say, well, there's X number of stages. Well, there may be, but that doesn't mean Tim and I are going to move through them the same way or at the same speed. And
Sure.
when Tim
And
moves
it
through,
doesn't mean that you couldn't go
there you
backwards
go.
or forwards,
That's
right?
right.
Like
Right.
it's
You could be
it's
you could
right.
be a number 4 and maybe be in a store and hear some background music, and it knocks you back down to number 1 because it's so raw
Absolutely.
in your memory, right? So, it, that grief
Right.
work is
Right.
really important. And then this is, AFSP does a bereavement program where they enlist people. It's a 2-day training program. Um, Brandon Anderson with the Agency Safety in Missouri, he and I went through it last summer, a year ago, and it was great information. But both of us kind of felt that it really wasn't our cup of tea, because what they were trying to get you to do is start, for lack of better words, online support groups. And that's, when if you do something like that, in my eyes, you got to be committed to continue to do that, because by the time you finally win people's trust, you can't say, oh, I don't have time for this anymore. I mean, that's just gonna hurt them some more.
Okay. So here is what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking is that because of John's connectivity issues, I'm wondering if we should, like, I just have to tell you, like, I'm really struggling because like I know that this topic is so sensitive, and I feel like I'm a little distracted, and I don't mean to be at all. And so Tim, I just have to apologize, like, if it's
No,
coming
that's fine.
across as like very choppy. Like I'm so, and you know what? I'm going to record. We're recording right now. So I want Clay, I want you to have this back on. But like I need people to hear the struggle that I'm having right now, because this topic is so close to my heart. It's obviously close to y'all's heart. Technology sucks, right? And we want to be able to have a conversation and be present and be mindful and not make somebody feel like we weren't giving them all of our attention, But at the same time, life is happening. And like, this is part of, I think, the grief that can come, is that you want to pay attention, you want to hone in on somebody, you want to focus on somebody, and then also, like, life gets in the way sometimes, and that can make it really hard to process that. And why I can imagine that having social supports who have understood exactly, maybe not exactly, but pretty darn close, like, that's why it's so important. Like, you want somebody to feel important, and you want somebody to feel your care. And also, like, it's really hard to do that all the time, which is why those social supports are so darn important.
Absolutely.
And we're all very imperfect. So, you could have all the trainings in the world, and you're still probably not going to say the right things all the time. And that's got to be okay, because at least you're trying, right? I'm assuming, Tim, that that's what your program about, talking and conversations really hits home.
It does. Both in terms of preventing suicide, but also in dealing with the aftermath of suicide. As I said, suicide doesn't just affect the immediate family. It affects the community. It affects the workplace. It affects religious communities. Everyone that person has touched, or even people that they did not know,
right,
but that hear about it, it affects them. For every suicide in the United States, there are at least 25 other attempts. And that's not a contagion. That's just a reality.
I was talking to my mom the other day, and I'm going to tread very lightly so I don't disclose anything. I was talking to my mom in the car on the way from Alabama to St. Louis, and she was reading a text to me that someone had sent her. And my mom is, a boomer. She didn't grow up knowing how to have these conversations, and she was reading this text to me. And I said to her, I'm like, Mom, this person is hurting. And I know you hate confrontation, Barb, but that's her name. I'm like, I know you hate confrontation, Barb. I was like, this isn't a confrontation. This is asking this person if they are okay, and saying you are concerned, you are here, and asking them the question, are you thinking about suicide? And she was like, I can't do that. And I was like, you can't not do that. And I was so proud of her, because she did. I had to kind of talk her through it, and she did. She asked the tough questions. Person on the other end said that they were okay, that they appreciated her asking. They didn't think she was being nosy. And then she followed up and said, can I reach back out tomorrow? And they said, you can. And she didn't solve the world's problems that day, right? But like, she felt like she did what she could and showed that person that she saw them, that she was paying attention, that she was listening. I think that, to your point earlier, Tim and John, you and I talk about this all the time. It's like, it's those little things. That's what keeps us moving forward in this work that is so hard and heavy.
Medically, health-wise, I do take medication for depression.
Yep.
I have a therapist who I see regularly, and as my therapist puts it, the time to see the therapist is before you're in crisis.
It's prevention. It's prevention.
And I wholeheartedly believe that.
I saw my counselor yesterday. That's right.
And you have to carve out some time. I admittedly am a bit of a workaholic, but I try to make time at least once a week to do something with a friend, with my wife, to have a little bit of time that's your time, that's your downtime, and to reflect.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's just so important. I really appreciate you talking about the importance of counseling and medication. There's such a stigma with that. I mean, still we're in 2024 and people are like, I don't need medicine. Well, why not? I take Lexapro. Like, it helps me not be a jerk. It's okay. It's really okay.
It's no different than if you're struggling with heart disease or diabetes or cancer.
That's right.
It's a health condition.
That is correct. Yep. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, John. I love when you call and tell me what to do. And anytime you call, I will do what you want me to do. I really appreciate you both taking the time to highlight what is being done and also what more can be done, because the need for social supports and connection is so critical. And so when you all bring these programs to Missouri, I hope you will come back on the podcast and we can talk about all of the things that you are implementing. So thank you very much for being on and for being with me today.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks for joining us at The Preventable, brought to you ad-free by Prevent+Ed. Prevent+Ed works to reduce or prevent the harms of alcohol and other drug use through education, intervention, and advocacy. Please visit their website at PreventEd.org. Like what you heard? Rate, review, and subscribe to stay up to date with what we are serving on The Preventable.